remember sitting here a year ago and the idea of a cancer moonshot hadn't really even been proposed, and here we are a year later and suddenly there seems to be quite a lot going on. Now, I was unfortunately under the misapprehension, misunderstanding that you were dealing with the more scientific priorities. That's the Blue Ribbon panel. You're doing something a little bit different. Why don't you explain to us what it is exactly that the task force is doing and how that differs from the Blue Ribbon panel that Biden had asked for?
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you
for having me, number one. Number two, there is no going to do when you start in February and you only have 9 months. So everything we've been doing, we're doing, not going to do. So very quickly, when the president established through a memorandum the cancer moonshot effort, he did two things. He created a task force of about 20 cabinet, sub-cabinet agencies and created an executive director for that task force, which is my job. And he asked the National Cancer Institute to convene a Blue Ribbon panel to look at their priorities scientifically for the moonshot, some of which can be done with current budget, some of which would need additional budget. So the moonshot, if you will, is partly the Blue Ribbon panel's report on the science, and then at a major level, all of the government agencies that touch cancer in any way, coordinating under the vice president's leadership to come up with new collaborations, new programs, new projects that they can get twice as much done in half the time. And then there's also the private sector aspect of this, where the vice president has been out talking to cancer centers, companies, patient groups, international scientists to develop a collaborative environment in the private sector. And when the task force delivers its report about the agency work to the president, the vice president will submit his own report, a very personal report about the private sector efforts as well as his vision for where we should go as a country.
Can you give us a timeline for those activities?
Before November.
Before November. I'd like you to put some meat on those bones, because what you're asking, what you're setting out to do is get lots of federal agencies to work together. And so it would be nice to know how you envisage that working. And also really, I guess, the private sector sometimes is a willing partner, sometimes isn't. And I'd be interested in your perspective on the extent to which you are going to have to encourage, cajole, will, knock heads together. What is it that it really needs, in your opinion?
Well, first, cancer is an incredibly powerful motivational problem. Everybody's been touched by cancer. Literally everybody's been touched by cancer one way or another. So we do not have a problem asking people to do things. We have a problem with too much incoming that we can't get to in a timely way of people wanting to do things. Everybody from individuals to pharma, biotech companies, technology companies, every sector of society is very interested in being involved. So interest is not the problem. So just give you one transactional example of how we can help. George Washington University's public health dean called me up and said, we want to help. I said, great, get your digital students together. Come give me an idea next week of what your social media team could do around cancer. They showed up the next week. They said, we have a program for smoking cessation using social media and wearable technology to go to high-risk communities where the smoking rate's higher than average. Great. The next week, Case Western University and Cleveland Clinic came to see me, and one of the things they wanted to do, because there's a higher smoking rate in Cleveland and a higher lung cancer rate in Cleveland and a very low detection rate, was to use their science of addiction studies to deal with smoking in Cleveland and also focus on lung cancer screening. So I put the two of them together. And now they have a program in Washington, D.C. and Cleveland using social media, digital technology, and science of addiction studies to work on smoking and the populations in Washington and Cleveland that tend to be very susceptible to lung cancer and don't get screened. This has happened time and time again where IBM Watson came to us and said, we want to help. So we connected them to the VA. where cancer patients at the VA can now have their tumors sequenced through the DoD at the Walter Reed facility, which has a dozen Illumina X10 sequencers. And they will do that for free for the VA if they get a little tissue sample. That result is given to IBM Watson, which for 2 years will analyze it for free and compare it to all the known medical literature on how to treat that mutation, and then provide that to the tumor board at the VA to treat the patient. That used to take weeks to do and now can be done in a matter of days. And IBM didn't go to VA, they didn't go to DoD, they came to us and said, what's the best use of Watson in your world? And that was what we came up with. So we are getting, part of what we're doing is asking everybody to do their own moonshot. What are you doing now that touches people to prevent cancer, to diagnose it, or to treat it? Whatever you're doing, create your own plan to double the result in half the time. And that is to jump way forward. Why I don't worry as much as other people about what will happen to the moonshot in the next administration, because it's already out there and living in thousands of places.
See, I never liked the metaphor of the war on cancer, but listening to you talk about the moonshot, I'm now thinking that the moonshot's not a very good metaphor either, because it's not a moonshot. I mean, the idea of a moonshot is everyone gets around and says we're going to the moon, and then you build a big rocket and then you go. And it seems to me that what you're doing is more like a war, really.
Well, do I have metaphors? I've got lots of metaphors. Number one, when Kennedy said we're going to the moon, he didn't say we're going to study moonology. He didn't say we're going to create new tenure tracks for rocketry. He said we're going to send a human being to the moon and bring him back alive. That was the goal. The technology was the means. In what we're doing, we're dealing with big data, we're dealing with supercomputers, we're dealing with all kinds of technical immunotherapy, all of that. But those are a means to an end, and in our case, the end is very similar to what Kennedy was doing. He said, we can get a human being to the moon and back safely. We're saying we're going to get you through your life without being ravaged by cancer. You may get cancer, but we're trying to turn it into a chronic disease. Through some of our programs, you might not get cancer. And if you have a cancer we can't treat today, we want to double the work and get there in half the time to a new therapy. So we are trying to help technology serve humanity in a very different way. Now, in terms of the war on cancer, this is really a great point. Nixon declared war on cancer. He had no army, he had no weapons, he had no strategy, but he knew it had to be done, and he wanted to distract from the war in Vietnam. So today, we have an army of incredible scientists and doctors. We have millions of patients who've been treated and studied. We have incredible weapons like immunotherapy and new forms of radiation and other things. And now what we needed was someone to marshal all of that into a strategy. And that's what Vice President Biden is doing. He is marshaling through NCI's Blue Ribbon Panel as a strategic vision, and through organizing scientists and institutions to share data and to work together as an army instead of individual fiefdoms. We now can truly have the end of the war on cancer, not starting another war on cancer.
But I mean, what authority does he have to get people to share data?
He has incredible moral authority. Inside the government, he has more than moral authority. He has, I'm the vice president and you're not, authority. And the president made very clear that the vice president has total authority over the agencies for the cancer moonshot to rearrange things. But we have meetings on a regular basis, and they're accelerating, to talk to all the major networks like Orion, Genie, CancerLink, DataSphere, to talk to all the major cancer centers, Sloan Kettering, Dana-Farber, MD Anderson. We have got to put the data together. We cannot have a financial system if your bank could only pay bills in your zip code, but your medical data never leaves the building where it was generated. This is not a system. It's the opposite of a system. So we need two things at a very simple level, which we are capable of doing as a country, and we're capable of doing it quickly. We need a thesaurus for all the data we've got that was entered in millions of different ways by doctors everywhere, so that we can take the thesaurus and turn one person's broken leg into another person's broken femur, and a computer will know what you're talking about. That's existing data problem. But for future data, we've got to have a dictionary that we all agree to, just like the Oxford English Dictionary, that says when you're dealing with the patient and you're diagnosing cancer, these are the terms you use, these are the lab tests you check, these are the ways you measure it, and stop this everybody has his own system, because it's literally killing patients. When something good happens, it's really difficult for other people to find out. And when something bad happens, way too many people get the same treatment when we know it doesn't work. So those are the two things we need, and we have every tool we need to do it. And the companies and the centers and the hospitals are being responsive, but they need someone like Vice President Biden to move them quickly to that solution, because there's an enormous institutional inertia around doing things the way you do them now.
But I mean, is it not the case that most medical records in America are dealt with by pretty much one company, Epic? Is that correct?
Yes, or yes. I won't make a Wizard of Oz analogy, but yes.
So presumably they would have to be willing and interested to sort of be involved in this sort of effort.
Interestingly, and this is a mem of the vice president's, the president and the vice president put $35 billion into the Recovery Act in 2009 for the adoption of electronic medical records and health records. They had no idea what they were going to get was 5 monopoly systems that don't talk to each other. You know Pete Thiel's line that we were expecting, wings and jetpacks, and we got 120 characters? That's what happened with electronic medical records. Now, for the Precision Medicine Initiative, the major dominant proprietary players have agreed to open their system and be interoperable for the 1 million patient cohort that's in the Precision Medicine Initiative. So you know what I'm going to say next, right? If they can do it at all, then they need to all do it for everybody, right? How hard should this be? Well, the answer is it's going to be really hard, and the only solution is to have a blunt force discussion that we did not create the electronic medical record system in this country to keep data from patients. And yet, the cost and time to get your records from any of those systems is a scandal, and we've got to stop it. There's just no way around it.
I'm delighted to hear that you're sufficiently agitated about this issue, because, yes, absolutely.
Since my own cancer records had to be faxed from Sloan Kettering to GW, when they both have digital systems I can access online, really what opened my eyes to, if those guys can't trade it electronically, God help you if you live in Memphis or Little Rock.
I mean, also the potential, the economic potential as well is enormous. I mean, if you think about what you could do if you had at your disposal that much data, I mean, it's phenomenal. A lot of people come and invest in the National Health Service because they have access to, this huge integrated, well, it's not actually that integrated, but they have access to a pool of patients, right? And so that's very attractive as well for businesses to sort of invest. So it would be a great resource to have.
Exactly. I mean, think for a minute about all the data you share you don't even know you're sharing.
Right.
And that they find if you go on a website, you use your cell phone in a given area, and then they market to you all these things, and they know your patterns and what book you're going to order next and what movie Netflix thinks you should get. And that's not something you even really gave them consent to do.
Right.
And they're making money off you, which you should get a piece of, but you don't, although there's a movement to do that. So how is it that in the most important aspect of your life, where you want someone to use all this AI technology to help you plan your healthy life, you can't get the data from where it is to where it should be? And we can't tap the resources of the entrepreneurial society in IT to have them do that. This has got to happen. If this were the credit card industry, we would all be writing checks.
Corinne Ashtier, head of Precision Medicine, Thermo Fisher. Question with 2 points. 1, what will the funding mechanism be? And 2, how will you prioritize research from clinical endpoints?
So the Moonshot task force itself is in the executive office of the president, so we don't have a budget. We are not a funding group. The funding groups remain NCI, to some degree VA, DOD, and NIH. As you may know, an extra $2 billion was put in the appropriations bill for NIH. And then there's a request for $1 billion dedicated to the Moonshot, which means the programs identified by the Blue Ribbon Panel, as well as some additional funding for FDA and a few other agencies that are part of the network. So the decision on that money won't happen this week, probably, but when they pass the continuing resolution. But we are hopeful it will happen after the election when they have another session. So all questions about what will be funded and how and why would have to wait until we see whether the additional money comes in. But keep in mind, the existing $5 billion at NCI, as well as billions in the industry, are still being invested with an eye to a lot of what I would call moonshot-related things, like immunotherapy, like new kinds of diagnostics, new ways of approaching chemo and radiation therapy, actually, in conjunction with immunotherapy. So there are a lot of moving pieces in the cancer funding world. The Moonshot is one part of it, but not all of it.
And the second part, will you come up with a system that would allow you to prioritize what will have clinical utility right now versus long-term research on?
Well, the good news is I won't, because I'm not a scientist and I don't even play one. But the NCI is still, I mean, they will be the locus for those kinds of decisions. And with the FDA and with their new Center for Oncology, there has been a lot of discussion of new forms of trials, new criteria for inclusion in trials, new use of real-world evidence, all of which will go to changing what we consider clinical trials, taking them more to communities rather than the big centers. And also, for instance, ideas like using a control arm that involves the standard of care data over and over again rather than continually enlisting more people in the control arm. Which doesn't, if you know how a control operates with the standard of care, you really shouldn't have to keep testing that as compared to the experimental arm.
That's very good. I'm going to just close the session by, I wonder if you can tell people here how they could get involved in the Cancer Moonshot. What could they perhaps do themselves?
Well, number one, I urge you to go to cancer.serve.gov, where serve.gov is a site for volunteering for lots of things. But if you go to cancer.serve.gov, you will find an enormous number of ways you can be involved. Secondly, if you go on to either whitehouse.gov/cancermoonshot, or you go on Medium, medium.com/cancer-moonshot, you will find a listing of 40 to 60 initiatives that have been begun by companies, universities, foundations, patient groups, communities, all around the Moonshot that were announced at our summit at the end of June. Our summit had 400 people in Washington, but the headline was we had 7,000 people at 270 separate sites in every state in Guam, Puerto Rico, all doing their own thing. And if you look at all of those efforts, your company or you or your foundation or your university will find things that you can join. You will find collaborations that you can join. So I urge you to do that, because the Moonshot, as I like to say, doesn't live in the White House. It lives at your house. It's an idea. And the idea is whatever you're doing, you can double it in half the time if you really put your mind to it.
All right, well, with that, could I ask you to thank Greg? I'd like to just say what an amazing day this has been. We've heard about some exciting science, we've heard from patients, And it seems to me that we are on the verge of some really big changes. Bringing it all together, as we're hearing, is part of that.